of much of life on Earth will not be resolved by one action or one agency alone. There is no magic bullet. They will require a comprehensive suite of urgent measures, including ecosystem protection and restoration, biodiversity conservation, a massive reduction in pollution, the end of ecocide, and further and rapid efforts to address climate change, together with an investment in nature on a scale never before imagined. Today, our webinar explores one of the possible measures that we can take in relatively short order, a fourth protocol under UNTOC to better define and address illegal wildlife trade. Each of our expert panelists will speak for 6 or 7 minutes, giving us their perspective and exploring the rationale for a wildlife crime protocol. And then there will be a question and answer session. My colleague, Dr. Mark Jones, Head of Policy at Born Free, which is hosting this event, will be curating questions which are invited to submit during the presentations using the chat function on Zoom. And I will then present a selection of questions on your behalf to our panel. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. John Scanlon served as Secretary General of CITES during 2010 to 2018. And in April of 2018, he joined African Parks as its first special envoy. And since June this year, he also serves as special advisor to the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and chair of the UK Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. John has worked in the private sector, in government, and in the UN, including in senior positions with IUCN, the World Commission on Dams, and UNEP. In Australia, after starting his career in private legal practice, he served as Chief Executive of the Department of Environment, Heritage and Aboriginal Affairs, Commissioner on the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, and as an advisor to state and federal environment ministers. John holds a Bachelor of Laws, a Master of Laws, Environmental, and is an accredited mediator. In 2019, he was awarded the prestigious Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished services to wildlife conservation and protection through roles with international organizations. And it's a pleasure to welcome John and to hear your opening presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Will. And thanks also to your good team for organizing today's event, as well as to our wonderful panelists and to everyone who has joined us online today. And today we do have a fantastic opportunity to say who we are and present details of possible new and groundbreaking legal agreement on preventing and combating wildlife crime. One that could help us to end these highly destructive crimes and to avoid future wildlife-related pandemics. Now, just a few quick words on who we are, and Will, you touched upon this. The Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime was launched on the 5th of June. We have a diverse group of people and organisations working through our steering group with international champions and supporters, as well as with special advisors. And we do have disparate views on many issues, but we all converge on the need to make several critical reforms to our international laws to make them fit for purpose in a post-COVID-19 world. Now, we are encouraging states to proceed with 2 interrelated but not interdependent reforms. Firstly, to amend wildlife trade laws to build public and animal health into decision-making, thereby taking a One Health approach to wildlife trade. And just last month, we released a set of amendments that could be made to CITES to achieve this objective. And secondly, to create a new international legal agreement on wildlife crime, which we're going to talk about just now. Now, these 2 reforms are interrelated because come what may, we will see further restrictions put into place on the trade in wild animals, their markets and consumption that could pose a risk to public health. And if we want to avoid seeing these activities simply moving underground, we must scale up our collaborative enforcement efforts. Now, we've been talking about these reforms to many people in many countries, including within government, international organizations, industry associations, NGOs, the private sector. And the people that we're talking to can see the compelling logic behind what we are putting forward. But we have been asked to show them what such reforms may look like. And this week we've done just that in releasing details on the form and the content of a possible new agreement on wildlife crime. And we are indebted to the international law firm, Arnold and Porter, along with several independent expert reviewers for their pro bono assistance in putting all of this together. Now, firstly, let me touch upon form. The proposal is to create a new protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, and this is the main international instrument in the fight against transnational crime. And in fact, the parties are meeting right now as we're in this virtual side event. Now, the working title we've given to the protocol is the Protocol Against the Illicit Trafficking in Specimens of Wild Fauna and Flora. And if a protocol would be adopted, it would be the fourth protocol to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, the others being on human trafficking, migrant smuggling, and the illicit manufacture and trafficking in firearms. It would also be the first time that crimes that have a significant impact on the environment are specifically embedded into the international criminal law framework. And this would signify a powerful and unequivocal acknowledgement by states of the importance of preventing and combating these serious crimes in recognition of their devastating consequences for wildlife, livelihoods, economies, security, entire ecosystems, including their ability to sequester carbon, as well as to public health, and of the need to seriously scale up our collective response if we want to end them. Now, turning to the content of the draft protocol, in preparing the content, we've drawn upon the three existing protocols I just referred to, as well as to national legislation from many countries, including Australia, China, Mexico, Mozambique, and the US. And we've also drawn on the UN Office of Drugs and Crime Guide on drafting legislation to combat wildlife crime. Now, what does this draft protocol do? It does several critical things. Firstly, it embeds combating these crimes into the international criminal law framework, which is where they belong. It sets out the conduct that is to be criminalized. Namely, parties to the protocol would be agreeing to adopt legislation establishing as a criminal offence the illicit trafficking of any whole or part of a wild animal or plant, whether alive or dead, in violation of any relevant international agreement or domestic or foreign law. In short, it would apply to any species of wild fauna and flora, including fish and timber, that is protected under international or, importantly, any national law. And it addresses the harvesting, the taking, the processing, or possessing rather, the import or export or introduction from the sea of illicitly acquired wildlife. Now, amongst other matters, it would make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife or wildlife product into a country if it had been acquired in contravention of the national laws of the source country. Now, this would represent a remarkable expression of comity between nations, a mutual respect for one another's laws. But it doesn't just seek to combat these crimes. It also sets out commitments on collective efforts to prevent illicit trafficking in wildlife, such as raising public awareness of these crimes and on demand reduction, sharing information such as on known groups active in illicit trafficking, on their concealment methods, known transport routes, and on sharing forensics that are critical for investigating and prosecuting crimes. It addresses the role and responsibilities of the carriers of the contraband, on the verification of documents, and on training and technical assistance. And it will automatically trigger all of the tools that are available under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. This is an excellent draft protocol, but it's still a working draft. And it is intended to better illustrate what is possible if states decide to lift illicit trafficking in wildlife out of the trade arena and embed it in the crime arena where it belongs, and to capture in an agreed international criminal law instrument what needs to be done collectively to prevent and combat these highly destructive crimes. Colleagues, amongst many other initiatives, we created the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime in 2010. The UN General Assembly adopted its first ever resolution on tackling illicit trafficking in wildlife in 2015, with follow-up resolutions in 2017 and 2019. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime released its first World Wildlife Crime Report in 2016, and a second report this year. But it's not enough. Given what we know today about the scale, nature, and severe consequences of these serious crimes, now is the time to take our next leap forward in working together to end them. And we commend this draft to you, and we hope that states, along with civil society and the private sector, get behind it so that we can leave the next generation with a legal framework that is fit for purpose in a post-COVID-19 world. One that helps ensure a healthy and prosperous planet and gives us the best chance of avoiding future wildlife-related pandemics. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, John. And that's a fascinating and necessarily brief but ambitious overview of what we're setting out to achieve here. And next, I would like to turn to Dr. Zhang. Dr. Zhang chairs the steering board of the Global Environmental Institute, GEI, in China, whose mission is to foster dialogue and innovative solutions to protect the environment and enhance economic opportunity within China, as well as in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. An expert in environmental policy, integrated resource planning, watershed management, and civil society development, Dr. Zhang's guidance and vision has helped GEI stay on the leading edge of China's environmental work and sustainable development policy. Over to you, Dr. Zhang.
Thank you very much, Will, and I'm very honored to join this panel and to illustrate some of my experience regarding to illegal wildlife trade issues, mostly focused in China and neighboring countries, and to a certain degree extended to Africa. And I would like to say that China is important in this global deal if we are committed to reach a global agreement on illegal wildlife trade. China is important not only because of the size of the country, but also because China is traditionally, the consumption patterns has been greatly impact on the wildlife trade and wildlife consumptions. Not only on the consumption side, but also on the positive side, China in the past few years has been putting illegal wildlife trade on one of the top list of national policy changes. And for example, like in 1993, China banned the tiger bone and rhino horn trade, effective in 1993. And also ivory trade ban effective since 2018. And since then, there's a whole set of law enforcement effort, regulations, and interministerial collaborations happened to implement the ivory trade ban in China and with other neighboring countries. In the past few years, China has been organized COBRA operation, which is a regional multilateral effort to campaign on fighting against wildlife trade. And there's a COBRA 1 and COBRA 2, and later on there's a COBRA 3 effort, which has been very effectively impact on the issue. And example is, for example, in 2019, July 2019, there's a joint effort between China and Singapore target at ivory trafficking and seizing 8.8 tons of ivory and 11.9 tons of pangolin scale. And also in March 2019, China Customs Special Operation seized 2,078 pieces of ivory, totaling almost 8 tons of ivory smuggling being seized. I would like to give you 2 examples to illustrate why we need the international regime to address the issue. As I mentioned, China has been organized and leads a copra operation based on Axin-1. Axin-1 is a regional effort to against illegal wildlife trade, and with 10 ASEAN members plus China. Axin-1, under the Axin-1 umbrella, China led a copra operation in 2012 and 2013, later on 2015. The effort has been very successful and extremely impactful, and organized totally more than 24 countries from Africa all the way along the trade chain to China. However, the copra operation only lasts for 2 to 3 weeks. So it's a short-term campaign, and it didn't really continue with the international regime as a regular operation. So the impact is huge in one hand, but it's a one-off operation, and very difficult to continue now because of lack of funding and lack of mechanisms to coordinate so many different countries. So that demonstrates that we need institutionalize the international regime to allow joint law enforcement among different countries and to address the issue altogether. The second example, very interestingly, is Ji-Qiang has been heavily involved in the so-called illegal timber trade between Myanmar and China. In 2015, Myanmar began to implement illegal timber trade law, and which prohibited all the log trade from sea and land route to any countries. However, China and Myanmar has a long time timber trade between northern borders of Myanmar and China. The issue has been discovered by many international organizations, but it's difficult to address because although Myanmar has a timber ban, timber trade ban, China doesn't. Those timber species smuggling to China is not on the CITES list. So from Chinese point of view, those are not illegal timber. However, it is illegal in Myanmar. So the only solution is to reach a bilateral agreement to allow Chinese custom police and border control to enlist all those log timbers as illegal. So therefore, Ji-Qiang has been facilitate bilateral talks and finally reached a bilateral agreement on so-called forest corporations, which include the joint efforts to stop illegal timber trade. So that illustrates another example that the imbalanced legal systems actually provide huge gaps for the illegal wildlife trade to take place. Since last year, China and Myanmar both agreed to further strengthening the forest collaboration agreement to including wildlife trade. So this conversation has been conducted last year in Geneva at the CITES conference. And this year, both sides has been met at the border area to further discuss the details. So all these efforts illustrate two major efforts, two major issues that we need to address through the International Wildlife Protocol Initiative. One is we need to institutionalize the international regime and to allow international collaborations, and also to address the criminality based on different countries' legal systems. Secondly, I would like to also share with you our effort in pushing China and a lot of international organizations like WWF, like Greenpeace, pushing China to adopt the Lazy Act and EU's timber regulations and so on and so forth in China, which has a tremendous amount of difficulties because those are independent countries' law, and it's difficult to convince a sovereign country to accept any other country's law, yeah, unless reach a bilateral agreement or international agreement. So here, my point here is we do need an international regime to address all these issues altogether. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang, and very important points raised there, reflected actually in some of the questions that we're getting in. Now it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Professor Judi Wakhungu, whom I've known for many years. Her Excellency Professor Judi Wakhungu was appointed Kenya's ambassador to France, Portugal, Serbia, Monaco, and the Holy See in 2018. Between 2013 and 2018, Professor Wakhungu served as Kenya's Cabinet Secretary, which is a ministerial position, for Environment and Natural Resources. Her seminal achievements include enacting the Kenya Wildlife Conservation and Management Act 2013, the Kenya Environmental Management and Conservation Act Amendment 2015, the Climate Change Act 2016, and the Kenya Water Act also in 2016. Professor Wakhungu spearheaded the historic burning of Kenya's entire stockpiles of ivory and rhino horn in 2016, and in 2017, she banned single-use plastics in Kenya. She's the recipient of many international awards, including the Clark R. Bavin Wildlife Law Enforcement Award 2016 and the Oceans Award 2018. She serves on many national and international boards. So, Professor Wakhungu, Judi, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm pleased to be with all of you, my dear friends, this afternoon. And I'm operating from red zone, COVID-19 in Paris. Let me just start by saying that our wildlife is under severe stress. We're losing several species every second, every minute, every hour, every day, and every year. This is a total carnage. And who is fueling this carnage and the devastation of wildlife globally? Well, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, may I kindly ask all of you, just for 1 second, to look in the mirror. Kindly look in the mirror. And by doing so, you have all observed the most dangerous species on Earth, and that is us. According to an IPBES report, the health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. The top 5 causes are change in land use, direct exploitation of our organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. And this is according to the IPBES report. Many countries are at the risk of ecosystem collapse. I must repeat that again. Many countries are at the risk of ecosystem collapse. And a key driver of this collapse is illegal wildlife trade. The UNODC Wildlife Crime Report of 2020 highlights the following. We have created and enabled a scenario for zoonotic diseases to spread at unprecedented levels. Organized criminal groups are sabotaging the health of our planet through illegal wildlife trafficking. Nearly every country in the world plays a role in illegal wildlife trafficking. I want to reiterate that. Nearly every country in the world plays a role in illegal wildlife trafficking. Transnational criminal syndicates reap the benefits, but it is the disenfranchised and people in the communities that pay the highest price. Illicit wildlife crime sets in motion a vicious cycle that jeopardizes our environment, it jeopardizes our health, and it also jeopardizes our development. Governments, as the previous speakers have said, face many challenges in combating these crimes. Therefore, robust mechanisms and legal frameworks are urgently needed in all countries and all jurisdictions. These crimes can be adjudicated under a UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, which is the main instrument that we now have under the UN. The proposed protocol under the illicit traffic in specimens of wildlife, wild fauna and flora, if adopted, is important as it would enhance cooperation amongst countries, which is urgently needed. It would enhance sharing information amongst countries, and this includes forensic samples and information about illicit wildlife trafficking syndicates, capacity building and technical assistance, and also, most importantly, border controls. It is also important, ladies and gentlemen, to note that these syndicates are dangerous. They are dangerous. Why? They devastate our wildlife and therefore deny us the ecosystem services that especially the keystone species provide. These syndicates destroy livelihoods of the people that live with wildlife. The illicit wildlife crime syndicates are serious security risk amongst nations globally. And I don't need to repeat that to those of you listening to us today, that they are a serious security risk. But they also deprive our economies of much needed revenue. Ideally, and in an ideal world, we ought to be able to cooperate regionally and internationally. This means providing provisions for mutual legal assistance based on law enforcement cooperation. It also means enhancing opportunities for countries to conduct joint investigations, but it also means transparency amongst countries on organized criminal groups. But we must also together educate and to continue raising awareness about why we must end wildlife crime. And of course, public participation. And I must repeat this, public participation is key to achieving these goals. Clearly, consistent legislation across regions and internationally will be needed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, we just must try hard to work hand in hand. We are all aware that the traffickers are world champions at exploiting the legislative gaps amongst and between our countries. They really are world champions at doing this. Therefore, universal training amongst the judiciary is therefore extremely important. and international interagency capacity must be strengthened in all countries to tackle wildlife crime offenses. Let me just conclude by saying that it is therefore worth exploring the role of the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime in tackling these very serious security and environmental threats. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wakhungu. I'm trying to keep up with all the incredibly important points that are being made, and I'll try and get to corral some of those in due course. But let me turn now to Professor Dr. Tanya Wyatt, who is a professor of criminology at Northumbria University in Newcastle in the United Kingdom. Her expertise is in wildlife trafficking, having written 3 books, with 2 further books coming out shortly on the subject, as well as dozens of journal articles and book chapters on this particular issue. Much of her research focuses on the role of organized crime, corporate crime, and corruption in the perpetration of wildlife trafficking. She also investigates the often overlooked element of non-human animal welfare and the human-centered nature of the illegal wildlife trade. So, Tanya, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to Mark of the Born Free Foundation and to John Scanlon and the End Wildlife Crime Initiative for their invitation to join this panel. And lovely to meet my fellow panelists, Dr. Zhang and Professor Wakhungu. Some of what I'm presenting today is the collaborative work of myself and my colleague, Dr. Angus Nurse of Middlesex University, so I wanted to give him his credit. My argument for a 4th protocol is twofold. First, I'd like to discuss the advantages of having wildlife trafficking being recognized internationally as a crime. Second, I'll outline the benefits for law enforcement of this 4th protocol. Wildlife trafficking, as we've heard, is a serious crime contributing to the depletion and extinction of species. And CITES is the only international mechanism that currently attempts to address wildlife trafficking. Yet CITES does not require that violations of the convention be defined as crimes. So collecting, harvesting, killing, trafficking, etc. are not crimes, even if they are a breach of some CITES parties' national legislation. So in the first instance, having a 4th protocol specifically about wildlife trafficking sends a clear message about its severity. This could have deterrence effects. Global recognition as one of the most serious forms of organized crime could be symbolically very powerful, though obviously that we would have to investigate that and monitor that. Furthermore, as the only current mechanism for addressing wildlife trafficking, CITES is not up to the task of being a policing or a law enforcement agency, for the reason I've stated, but also because there are no requirements for the parties to have an enforcement authority. There's no obligation for the criminal justice system to actually be involved, though obviously there's a role for regulatory agencies like border and customs. At present, in CITES parties without enforcement authorities, which is 85 of the 183 parties, so nearly half of them, ministries of environment, institutes of zoology, botanic gardens, fisheries research are up against criminals who, as we've heard, are often serious and organized. Furthermore, nearly half of the parties have not fully implemented the convention as required, so the level of enforcement is nowhere near it needs to be to begin with. CITES is a trade treaty, not environmental or wildlife or criminal law. A 4th protocol on wildlife trafficking presents that opportunity to bring the principles of wildlife and criminal law to bear to protect species. These include prohibition acts which harm individual animals that are not permitted. And as we've heard from John Scanlon, this is the nation that's defining it, not CITES or an international scope. So it reaches out much further than CITES is capable of doing, not the 37,000 species listed in CITES, but gets more at this critical mass of 1 million species that are actually facing extinction. Wildlife law also incorporates ideas of res communis, so implementing a public good, wildlife as a common good for the planet. As I said, my colleague Angus Nurse and our colleague Keith Vincent have argued about. So this global crime getting a more holistic global response. Although the CITES Secretariat and the Standing Committee have the ability to sanction parties for non-compliance with the convention, this doesn't actually happen all that often, even though, as I've said, nearly half of the parties have not implemented the required legislation. In addition, there are other numerous issues with compliance with CITES requirements: failure to submit annual reports that include the trade data, failure to submit biennial reports that include updates on implementation, and there's several parties that have never submitted these, and failure to submit illegal wildlife trade data, which has been required for the last few years. All of these data are critical to understanding the nature and scope of wildlife trafficking and developing effective responses. It is not working to have a small staff of this convention oversee state obligations that are, in essence, breaching international wildlife protection standards. And finally, in terms of defining and recognizing on an international scale wildlife trafficking as a crime, this gives the global community, particularly the legal and law enforcement communities, the chance to draft an up-to-date criminal definition of wildlife trafficking that takes into account modern forms of committing crimes like cyber crimes, and then also includes the diversity of wildlife that we've mentioned. Adopt measures aimed at reducing wildlife trafficking that are not hindered by conflicts to uphold trade. And in a proposed draft by the End Wildlife Crime Initiative, obligations on the part of states to reduce demand, which are critical and an excellent addition to our fight against wildlife trafficking. It also promotes cooperation between state parties, particularly around information sharing, which is an ongoing problem, and is another mechanism to protect wildlife and prevent the worst forms of exploitation. Make it my second slide, please. Thank you. In regard to the benefits to the criminal justice and law enforcement stakeholders of this protocol specifically, I suggest these stem from the obligations on the states that come from UNTOC. As I mentioned, wildlife trafficking becomes a crime in all of the jurisdictions that ratify it, which is actually more than CITES. And the really strong benefit of it that John Scanlon mentioned earlier, of crimes in one nation are recognized as crimes in another nation under this kind of protocol. Importantly, money laundering, which we've been talking about for the last several years, then becomes a central element for the parties to address, as does corruption and the obstruction of justice. This is likely better in terms of corruption, which is absolutely central to the facilitation of wildlife trafficking, but only features in a 2016 resolution in CITES, which is non-binding. The required addition of these crimes extends the tools available to law enforcement officials. Again, these kinds of discussions have been taking place for the last several years, but since these obligations under UNTOC protocols, this has the potential to operationalize them much more widely. In addition, UNTOC protocols also make more concrete the cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different countries. This stems from what Professor Wakhungu mentioned around extradition, mutual legal assistance. These become much more embedded. These more formal relationships can potentially also combat corruption and possibly be more financially supported under an UNTOC protocol rather than current systems. And lastly, there are a variety of initiatives and programs that are supporting the training of wildlife law enforcement officials and trying to build capacity of CITES authorities, customs, forensics, and so forth. My sense from talking to those giving these trainings and seeing the different funding streams from the US and the UK and elsewhere is there is a lot of replication and waste in the current system. With a singular space where wildlife trafficking is defined, there's the potential to centralize or at least use UNTOC as the means of coordinating the training and assistance that is needed to combat wildlife trafficking. So this fourth protocol, I think, is an excellent next step to a much more coordinated and holistic approach to saving the world's wildlife. Thank you for joining us today, and I will just turn the discussion back now.
Thank you, Tanya. And of course, as always, time is going to beat us here, but I'm going to go quickly to John, maybe 60 seconds, John, just to extract a few of the core themes that have come out of the presentations. And then we've probably got time for 4 questions, 1 to each of the panelists, but very short answers, if you wouldn't mind. This is being recorded, and so there will be links made available on the End Wildlife Crime website and in other places so that you can catch up on this and some of the feedback. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to our panelists. There were 3 extraordinary presentations, very different, but complementary and compelling. They made a compelling case from 3 different perspectives of exactly why we need a 4th protocol to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. Dr. Zhang gave the reference to Myanmar. It shows you that if we try and go bilaterally one at a time, this is not going to work. This is a global issue that needs a global response. As Professor Wakhungu said, every country has a role to play. Now, we can get over some of the concerns Dr. Zhang referred to by having a multilateral agreement where we're all agreeing to the same thing at the same time, and picking up on Dr. Wyatt's point, respecting each other's legislation. You respect the legislation of a source country in the destination country, but only in the destination country. You say that the destination country, it's an offense to bring that contraband here because it was not acquired in accordance with the national law. Shows wonderful respect for the laws of other countries and respect for the protection of their wildlife in accordance with their laws. What was really compelling was the collective expression that we need to institutionalize this. We need to institutionalize the response. We cannot just have one-offs here and there that aren't funded over time. We need to institutionalize collective long-term commitment when we're all in it together and all playing by the same rules. Extraordinary presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And as I say, I'm going to try and squeeze 1 question in to each of the panelists, and then I'll wrap it, hopefully on time. I'm going to go initially to Dr. Zhang. Dr. Zhang, one of the questions that's come through to us is about the role of non-state actors and NGOs and other expert bodies that can assist in this. And since, as has been said several times, we're kind of all in this together, I wonder how you feel this can become a truly collaborative effort, both at state and non-state level.
Thank you very much. Non-state level. I just gave the example of GI facilitate Myanmar-China conversation on the wildlife, on the illegal timber trade issues, but also include wildlife trade. And this example is that we definitely know there's a political will to address the issues, but it's not in the national agenda, because it's from government point of view, this is small in terms of the total economic scale, and this is insignificant because it's not dealing with big countries like United States, EU, and Japan. It's a neighbor, small country in their opinion, and by then it's not politically significant to put on the priority list. However, with non-state players like NGO, like GEI in China, we are able to facilitate the bilateral conversation and to illustrate the importance of these issues. However important and successful it is, GEI spent 2 years to address the issue, which has been pointed out by international NGOs for 20 years. However significant it is, it's 2 years to address the bilateral issue. If we do it country by country, it takes 400 years to address the global issue, right? So what I'm saying here is we do need the international regime, and non-state players can easily identify the political will and spell out the political significance of the issue and to push the state players to the front chair, to the front line. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Extremely well put, and a segue into the next question, which I'm going to direct to to Professor Wakhungu. Judi, the question, and it arises out of what Dr. Zhang has said, is how do we gain political will and political traction? We've seen in the wildlife space some very strong advocates at state level, but also some systemic weaknesses. And I wonder how you feel, you know, in 60 seconds, how you feel these can be addressed as part of this global initiative.
I think that political will and courageous, and I must say courageous leadership, is what is needed. Whoever is in charge of the wildlife sector in each and all of these countries has to be extremely courageous to be able to make those decisions. One of the ways of going about this is just providing the powerful scientific analysis. This is what the science says. Politicians always want to make their own political decisions, which, as we know, changes from season to season. But the science does not. You know, the science improves with time. So the science must take the forefront of making this decision, but it needs also very courageous actors. As Dr. Zhang has said, non-state actors and state actors and private sector must work together. This is one planet. You know, there's not going to be a difference as to who's going to fare better than the other. Yeah. If we lose it all, we all lose it. But I know I've taken more than 60 seconds, but let's focus on the science, let's focus on the courageous leadership, and then let's all work together.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Wakhungu. And I'm going to turn to Tanya now. A question that's come through, Tanya, about what sanctions might exist to encourage or indeed, if necessary, censor when there is a failure of compliance with a protocol like this. I wonder if you have a thought or two about that.
Yes, thanks. So my understanding from recent developments at the convention itself is that there is a monitoring and evaluation system that is being put in place so that states will be monitored if they are actually implementing the various requirements that are presented, and that there can be sanctions against them in the form of the example I saw was of the discussion that maybe Japan wouldn't be able to hold the Olympics because they hadn't followed through on some elements of the protocol that they were, or of the convention that they were required to. So it seems to me that these are in the process of evolving, but that the convention is serious about actually sanctioning parties that haven't done what they have promised that they would.
Thank you very much. And finally to you, John, and then I've got 30 seconds of remarks to close with. John, one of the questions that's come through is, could not the protocol actually be drawn wider and embrace all serious and organized environmental crimes, of which wildlife crime would be a subset? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks, Will. And I think as we speak, negotiations are continuing on a possible resolution at this COP on environmental crimes, or crimes that have a significant impact on the environment. This is an emerging discussion. There's not yet full agreement on what the full scope of these crimes are, but it's good that this discussion is going on. What I'd say is what's going on with this discussion is complementary of and mutually reinforcing of what we're pursuing here. The reality is illicit trafficking in wildlife is well known, well recognized. The scale, nature, and consequences are well known. We've had 3 UN General Assembly resolutions directly on this point. We ought proceed now to embed this into the international criminal justice framework along the lines we've discussed today. And as I said, it's complementary of and mutually reinforcing of any other efforts that are going on that are still a little bit in their evolving stage. And can I just finish by saying, I couldn't agree more with the issue of courage. And Professor Wakhungu has shown oodles of courage throughout her career, as all of our panelists have today, in expressing themselves so eloquently and so powerfully. And it was fantastic to be a part of this discussion. Thanks, Will.
Well, thank you. And before I conclude, I just want to, on behalf of the, well, 155, it did tip over 160 participants tuned into this. I want to express our thanks to the panelists for their views, for their candor, and for their ambition. And I want to conclude not with a statement, but by actually just reading out the words that have come across to me as part of this discussion. We've talked about scale and critical mass and ambition and focus and urgency and inclusivity and practicality and measurable outcomes and a holistic response and a collaborative and collective approach to this. And as John has said, the word that I've underlined 3 times is courage, because if we have this conversation in 10 years' time, it will be too late to deal with many of the issues that we've talked about today. It will simply have gone past its sell-by date. So if we are going to tackle this issue amongst many pressing issues that the world needs to address, we have to find the ability, the political will, and the resources to do it now, not when I'm 70. Listen, I again want to thank every single person who has tuned in, and I want to thank all our wonderful speakers for their incredible insights today. And let's not do this again in 10 years' time. Thank you.